Hi guys! So as we all know, cosplay can be quite an expensive hobby, but it doesn't have to be. Today I'm going to run through some ways to make cosplays on a budget. So first, there are a few different ways to create and wear cosplay. 1, you can buy them, 2, you can make them, or 3 is a mix of the two. Each method is as valid as the others, and I'll go through each one, but which method works for you will sort of depend on the time, money, resources and even skills you have available at that time. This is something you'll get a feel for, so as your skill set improves you might find yourself going from buying something to making something, or you might find yourself commissioning somebody to do the work that you're not confident in doing to give you time to focus on the rest of the costume. So for example, I've gotten a lot better at making props, so I tend to build my own now. However, I know that I cannot do wigs. I end up with a big pile of matted hair and a parcel of shame to Luke. So tends to be I'll either buy a pre-styled wig or I will commission Luke to make them for me. Throw some money his way because he's much better at it than I am. Before you begin your cosplay, you're going to want to research and get reference pictures. This way you can figure out what components you need, what budget you're going to be working to, and even what time scale you're going to need. It's very easy to overlook parts of a costume, and you know, we've all done it. We've been in the hotel room the night before the convention frantically sewing or painting or gluing, or you get to the end of the month and you realise you don't have enough time for that wig to get here, or enough money to buy that prop that you really wanted to make your costume just pop. Take the time to break down the costume from the wig to the shoes, include any accessories you're going to need, any face paint, any makeup, any props, just absolutely anything you will need for the costume, write it down. There are apps that can help you keep track of your progress, so I know Cosplanner is one that Sarah uses. You can get a list of things you need to make, things you need to buy, even like helping you work out a budget, so those are very helpful as well. Let's start with the one that a lot of people starting out in cosplay do, and that's buying costumes. You can often find whole cosplay sets, usually minus the wig, on eBay for relatively cheap. These tend to come in a range of sizes, however they're not customised to fit you. So always look at the measurements carefully, compare them to your own measurements. A lot of these are made in China and Hong Kong, so the sizes do tend to run a little bit smaller. You also have to be aware of things like it will take longer to ship to you, and you might get hit with import charges, so those are things to be aware of when you are buying a costume. You can also source various parts of a costume separately rather than buying the full set. For example, our Hogwarts group, we bought our robes and ties on eBay. Then independently from each other we bought shirts and trousers, shoes, that kind of thing, from like Primark or supermarkets, and probably spent about £15 on the rest of it. Then we added our own accessories like wigs, necklaces, badges, that kind of thing, to make it more personal, I suppose. If that is the route that you want to go down, then I can give you a few tips for buying cosplay on the cheap. First, it is a given, but if you are going to buy a costume new, it is going to be more expensive. So what you can do is check the used section of eBay, or you can go on social media. There are several selling sites on Facebook that I know of where people will sell on old costumes that they have retired or they're no longer interested in, or possibly even no longer fit. That does happen. They do sell full cosplays, they do sell partial cosplays, they sell wigs, accessories, all that kind of thing. So just check the listing, make sure what you want is in that listing, check the measurements. The other place that you can get them for cheaper is actually at conventions. Some conventions will do a bring and buy, so people will bring in old costumes to sell on. Obviously it's a bit more difficult to check the sizing on that, but it is a good way to get a costume for cheap. The next one is if you are using eBay. If you use the word cosplay, LARP, the character name, the show, or anything like that, it will bring a lot of relevant results, but the price immediately goes up. Instead, if you can break it down into components and look for each part separately, then that can decrease the price for you. So instead of looking for a Newt Scamander coat, I looked for a blue greatcoat, and that brought in a lot more results and a lot cheaper results. So those are my tips for buying cosplay. Next, if you feel confident enough, you can always make your cosplay from scratch. Sometimes this can be cheaper than buying a full cosplay, or in some cases it can be particularly hard to find or source the costume that you're looking for. Sometimes this can be the easier option. If you do this, make sure that you have each part planned out. Get patterns to help you and try and make most effective use of your fabric as you possibly can. It is worth using an old bedsheet to do a mock-up of your costume. That way you can make any alterations at this stage rather than wasting the good fabric on something that doesn't work out the way you thought it was going to. So if you want to make your cosplay, some tips for this would be you can buy fabric online for cheaper, however it can be a bit more difficult to know exactly what you're getting. If you go to a fabric shop, you can have a feel for what the fabrics are like, get a rough pricing, you know, get patterns, you can look up the name. You can then get that name and look it on eBay, and you might find it for cheaper. The second tip I would give you is a lot of places will offer samples, so for 99p you can get a little sample size, and this is actually really worth doing, even though you might be spending a little bit more to get those samples. It is worth it rather than buying, you know, 5-10 meters of a fabric that turns out isn't the right one. So it's definitely worth getting a sample if you're a bit unsure as to what the fabric is going to feel like, or, you know, if it's the right colour. My next tip would be if you have a particularly odd or specific pattern need. Places like McCall's and Simplicity actually do cosplay patterns. So if you go on Facebook and have a look through some of the fan sites, or just pop a question up, and they might be able to find a pattern that suits what you want. That way you don't have to go through different patterns and try and alter them, or like buy something that doesn't really work. They will help you find what's going to be best for you. But you don't have to buy expensive patterns. You can use pre-existing clothes as patterns and just draw around them, add a bit of seam allowance, or what I tend to do is buy really cheap ones in charity shops, cut them up, use that as a pattern, because again, add some seam allowance, so it doesn't have to be expensive. And my last tip for making a cosplay is you don't have to buy expensive materials like Warbler to make props. So cheap foam from the kids' craft section like Funky Foam can be used to make armour pieces, plastic bottles can be used to create base shapes for guns, and you can even use paper mache to great effect. I know Sarah made one of her sonic screwdrivers from a light up pen and some craft foam, and it looks wonderful. And finally, the last one is a mix of buying and making. Many cosplayers do this, especially if you are doing a character who wears normal everyday clothes. It's probably one of the cheapest ways to create a costume, but it can also be more time consuming because you have to source each bit separately. So if you have a character who wears regular clothes, you can buy various bits and pieces of their costumes in shops and online, and then edit them to work for that character, whether it's tailoring, painting, cutting, sewing, any alterations like that. You'll likely get a very good effect from this method with enough patience. So for example, if you are doing someone from The Wolf Among Us or Borderlands, you can get the tops, the trousers, and then you can use fabric paint to create cell shading. I've seen a lot of people do this and it looks amazing. Or if you have a character that needs like a one sleeve top, you can get a top, cut the sleeve off, sew up the edges. So my tips for mixing and matching would be don't go for expensive brands. Utilise shops like Primark or Supermarket to get relatively cheap clothes, or better yet, raid charity shops or car boot sales. Even eBay can be a goldmine for base clothes for cosplay. Number 2, it doesn't have to just be clothes, this can work for props too. Toy guns and swords from pound shops or dollar stores if you're in America. These can be modded and painted to work for your costume. Halloween is an amazing time to nab bits and pieces for cosplay. And my final piece of advice for mix and match would be to plan what you're doing with each piece. So whilst it's quite a cheap way of doing things, you probably don't want to find the perfect colour top and then cut the wrong bit. and end up having to source it all again. So yeah, just plan out what you're going to do with it, know what you're going to do before you go ham on it. So that is the basics of how to make this hobby a little bit less expensive. If you've got any tips you want to share with us, please leave us a comment below, and we'll see you next time. Bye!